It's a great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Karen Kilby. She's the Bede Professor of Catholic Theology at Durham University. She's formerly held posts at Birmingham, Nottingham and St Andrews Universities and has written various books and articles specializing in particular on the theological writings of Karl Rahner and Hans Urs von Balthasar. Although I think most clergy will say that it's important for us to keep up with our theological reading in some way, all of us know that the time to do that is limited. And that's why I always find it very difficult to warm to theological writers who don't try as hard as possible to make what they're saying as clear and lucid as they can. Now, Karen's writing, I'm glad to say, is marked by, kind of passes this test with flying colours because it's marked by exemplary clarity and simplicity, moving logically and elegantly from one point to another, even when she's discussing apparently abstruse points by notoriously complex theologians. Those of you who, in particular, who've specialized in branches of learning outside the humanities may be interested to know that Karen did her preliminary degree in mathematics at Yale University. And I haven't actually talked to her about this, but it always seems to me that her careful and logical and clear approach and her concern always to kind of show her working reflects that mathematical background. In addition to her academic work, Karen is closely involved in the life of the Church at many levels, and among her doctoral students, she has several serving Anglican clergy and has had quite a number in the past. So it's a delight to welcome her this morning as the first of our keynote speakers, as she addresses us on vocation, joy, and suffering. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's a little bit terrifying as a layperson to address hundreds of experts and people who have vocations. So we'll see whether I survive the ordeal. What I want to talk about, can everybody hear me, first of all? Okay, yeah.
Could you just turn it a little bit in or up?
Okay, I'll try to project a little more. I think somebody else is, I'm... Is that better?
Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you. So I want to talk about what vocation looks like. Address the question, what does it look like to have a vocation, to live out a life following a vocation? So I've realized I'm not quite addressing what it feels like. I'm not addressing vocation from the inside in a way, but when we see a life, how do we think about it in terms of vocation? You may want to question me about this afterwards, but you have a whole 45 minutes to have a go at me later, so there should be time. So I want to talk about two different images of vocation that I myself wrestle with. And a very brief, crude version of this, as indicated by my title, might be vocation as joy and vocation as suffering. On the one hand, we might say that when we think of a person who's truly found their vocation, we think of a person we think of this as a person who's fulfilled by their role in their life. Their abilities, their gifts, their interests, their deepest desires coalesce. They find their place, their function, their true identity, their particular contribution to make to the church, to the world, to the community. And there's a joy in this. You love what you do, you put your whole self into it. There's a sense of integration and integrity. It's what you were made for. This is one image of what it is to have found your vocation. On the other hand, we might say that we think of a person who's truly committed to their vocation as a person who's willing to sacrifice and suffer, to endure and struggle, to remain steady to their path through adversity and affliction. Now, any audience worth their salt will immediately want to resist having an either-or foisted on them so early. So you're probably saying, why not both? Why not both at the same time, maybe? Why not, in the course of a single life, allow that a single vocation can sometimes be fulfillment and sometimes suffering? And we can come back to that sort of question later. But to begin with, I want to try to make these two ways of thinking about vocation a little more real and more complex by personifying them. I suggest we might think about this question, what does it look like to follow a vocation, by contemplating two figures in Christian history, one ancient and one fairly recent. So one figure I'm choosing is the one that my post is named after, Bede, known as the Venerable Bede, a monk of Wearmouth Jarrow monasteries. And the other is Oscar Romero, the famous El Salvadorian bishop, who's already commemorated as a saint by Anglicans, I believe, and who in a few weeks' time will be canonized in Rome. But before beginning with Bede, I want to make a few more preliminary comments on how I'm thinking of vocation. First of all, I take it to be a pretty broad category. I don't think it's something that only vicars and priests, nuns and monks have. Vocation is not just vocation to ministry, ordained or otherwise. Now, my two examples, as a matter of fact, were ordained, and of course, you, my audience, are, I presume, all or mostly ordained. But my wager is that even for you, even for people who felt called to ordained ministry, it'll be more helpful to think of vocation in a much broader way. And I can understand from what I heard last night, that is also the way your year of vocation in the diocese is framed. But to do that, the diocese and I, in taking vocation in this broader way, it should be said that we're going both against a large swathe of tradition and against certain pretty strong, deeply embedded habits of our current practice. So for much of the tradition, until Martin Luther, in fact, the laity were precisely those who lacked a vocation, who weren't called. Vocation was understood as either a vocation for personal holiness and a life of evangelical perfection, poverty, chastity, and obedience. This is what monks and nuns were called to. Or vocation to office in the church, to a role and certain powers and authority, which is what priests and bishops had. And again, in contemporary practice, I don't know many who would outright say that lay people lack vocations, but nevertheless, most of our talk about vocations swirls around priesthood and ministry. This is particularly striking in a Catholic context, where we talk about the number of vocations, about a shortage of vocations, or where we're occasionally asked to pray for vocations. And we all know that what we're talking about is the number of men who will come present themselves as candidates for the priesthood. But even in my travels among Anglicans, my sense is that the one real context in which vocation is consistently discussed and reflected on is in relation to ordination, or perhaps ministry more generally. Most of you, I'm willing to bet, will have a story to tell of a quite particular journey towards the recognition of a vocation or calling to where you are now, to your ministry. Maybe you have a story of wrestling with it, maybe at first resisting it, eventually accepting that there was a call. And I'm even more confident in predicting that nearly all of you will have spent time in conversation about your vocation, discerning it, discussing it with other people, with a DDO, a selection conference with fellow ordinands. But I'm not sure how widely that experience will be shared by the laity, by Anglicans who haven't gone through selection and ordination training. Now, sometimes in Catholic circles, the response to this one-sided emphasis on the clergy is to turn to a focus on lay ministry and the notion of the priesthood of all believers. So I should probably just say in passing that in presuming that we all have vocations, I'm not primarily thinking about either of those concepts, lay ministry or the priesthood of all believers. I don't have anything against them, but they're a little bit narrow. They both seem to be a way of making a little bit of room for the laity in a vision that has the ordained at its center. So rather than seeing laity as somehow sharing in the role of those in ministry, I think it makes more sense to go in completely the opposite direction and I'm sure that many of you do this already, part of the calling of those in ministry, part of the vocation, is precisely to have a role in recognizing and fostering and appreciating the vocations of others. Some of the most inspiring priests and ministers I've known are those who are themselves inspired and energized and delighted by the varied gifts and lives of their congregants. So it's not so much that the laity can share in and support the vocation to ministry of the clergy, as that the clergy can exercise their ministry, their own quite particular calling, by sharing in and supporting the callings of the laity. So after those preliminary comments, let me turn now to the Venerable Bede. Living in the northeast of England, as I now do, Bede's name, along with that of St. Cuthbert's, is everywhere. It's on colleges, schools, parishes, Rotary clubs, working men's clubs, medical units. And not only is my own position named after him, but his tomb is only about 200 or 300 yards from my office. But assuming you're not all so surrounded, let me begin by reminding you a bit about who he was and the nature of his life. This is really just a sketch, so we can think together about the contours of a life. And I should warn you, if you ask me too many questions, I'll say, well, I'm not actually an early medieval historian. I'm not an expert on Bede. Bede was born in the early 670s and he died in 735, so his life crosses between the 7th and 8th centuries. He's best known for his ecclesiastical history of the English people, as the first historian of the English, as a shaper of the very concept of Englishness, as well as a major shaper of the discipline of history. Bede is so consistently associated with that text that if you've heard of him at all, you might think it's the only thing he did or the only work of his which survives. But in fact, this is a very long way from the case. He wrote other works on history, a kind of chronicle of world history, a history of the abbots of his own monastery. But he also wrote biblical commentaries, commentary on Genesis, a commentary on the book of Revelation, and many in between. Ezra, Nehemiah, the Gospel of Luke, of Mark, the Acts of the Apostles, and so on. He wrote many homilies. There are many collections of there are collections of many of his homilies. He wrote on music, on grammar, on methods of calculating time, the calendar, how to teach calculation methods. He was a major influence, in fact, on how we now mark the years. He didn't invent it, but he was the one who did a lot to make it standard to use the year of Christ's birth as the 0 point. He was immensely committed as a teacher. He was in charge of teaching in his monastery, and he wrote manuals for his students. And so, although we now think of him primarily as the sort of father of English history, and as the narrator of the lives of St. Cuthbert and St. Hilda, and of the great Synod of Whitby, during the Middle Ages, he was known principally as an interpreter of Scripture. And exegesis was very much at the center of his work. So what I want to bring Bede in here for is not to talk about any particular theological insight he had, and not about his contribution to history, or about to what degree he went beyond the early church fathers and did something of his own, how much he was a transmitter of them. But the shape of his life is something I find quite striking. He entered the monastery when he was 7, given as an oblate, presumably by his family. And he remained in this one monastery, or this pair of monasteries, the whole of his life as a monk. He never left the north of England. He went as far south as York at one point to visit a former student who was now a bishop there, but that seems to be the extent of his travels. He never became an abbot. He was never involved in any major controversies, fighting off any great heresies. And on the day of his death, he was working on his translation of John's Gospel. So, as much as anything, what brings the shape of his life into relief, into clarity, is what he didn't do, what isn't part of the story of his life as we receive it. He could have gone traveling on the continent. He lived far from the center of things, far from Rome. He knew that he lived sort of on the edge of the world. And other monks found reason to go and learn what was going on and go to where things were exciting. But he stayed in his monastery reading and writing and teaching. And even more strikingly, I think, he didn't withdraw from any of this towards the end of his life. He's not presented to us as a figure who's saintly because he withdrew. If you think of some of the other examples around St. Cuthbert, about whom Bede wrote, who's the one other name plastered everywhere in the northeast, including at the Durham Cathedral is the shrine of St. Cuthbert. St. Cuthbert was a great leader. He was known for his great deeds, but when he knew his death was approaching, he retired to become a hermit again, to go for the higher things, the purer things. Or think of Thomas Aquinas, perhaps the greatest mind of the Middle Ages, who was reportedly so struck by a vision from God 3 months before his death that he ceased to write and said that all that he had done was just straw. Those are those kind of more familiar examples to my mind. And against the background of this sort of story, the portrait of Bede's final day, where he'd been up all night in prayer, and then he was both correcting something about natural history from Isidore, because he said it would be a terrible shame if his students lost time with mistakes that were left after he was gone. And he was working on his translation of the Gospel of John. And there's a story that a young scribe who was taking down what he said to him, I have one more sentence to write. So he said, okay, put it down. And the scribe said, it's done. And then he quoted from the Gospel of John. He says, it is finished. And indeed, that's true. And then he said, glory be to the Father and the Son. And he died on the floor of his cell. His, it seems, was a calm, focused life devoted entirely within the context of the rhythm of monastic prayer and monastic community to learning, to understanding, learning for himself, learning for his students, learning everything he could from those who'd gone before and passing it on with whatever new understanding he himself could add. Now, he's usually spoken of as the Venerable Bede, or Bede the Venerable, but he is also, for both Catholics and Anglicans, considered a saint. So you might ask, what does this mean? What is there in this life that qualifies him as a saint? We could, of course, be cynical and say, well, it means that his students were good publicists, and it's a kind of contingent outcome of church history. But if we're willing to accept this judgment of tradition, if we allow ourselves to enter into it, then what is it that we might take as the holiness of this particular life? What I'd like to propose is that Bede is kind of model of a man with a vocation. He was made to be a scholar. He had the ability, he wrote beautiful Latin, he learned Greek, he managed to sort of teach himself Greek and some Hebrew, he read everything he could, he gathered all the information from any visitors who came through. A tremendous capacity for work, tremendous output, he was tremendously focused. So he had all the gifts of focus and linguistic ability and so on. He clearly had the desire. No one, as far as we know, commanded him that he must devote his life to texts and to understanding, to writing history and commentary on the Bible and scientific and mathematical works. Presumably, many of his fellow monks would not have chosen to live this way. And as I say, he could have gone and done other things, had a more exciting life in some ways. It's clear that from what others did, that the principle of stability of monastic life didn't prohibit going off and seeing what was happening in other cities. But he just didn't seem to want to. He had the resources he needed, an excellent library, time, peace. He did what was in him to do for the whole of his life to its very last day. Now, all that is not aimed as a sales pitch for the academic life or to try to make anyone feel guilty for not having more scholarly impulses or spending more time reading books. But it's a case study of someone whose life and holiness is very thoroughly integrated around a particular calling. And when I say this, I'm not suggesting that we have to assume that God whispered in his ear sometime early in his life, Bede, I have a special plan for you. You're to be the father of theological and historical work through the Middle Ages. Maybe God did. Who am I to say that God didn't? But whether or not there was something so explicit, I think we can see in Bede 4 things coming together. The God-given gifts, in this case, linguistic abilities, patience, memory, focus. God-given desires, the desire for the truth, for understanding, the love of learning and teaching, to desire to know about God and God's works in the world. The needs of the broader community, so God's gifts, God-given gifts, God-given desires, the needs of the broader community. Bede's learning is always as much for others, for his students, for the community, for the building up of those around him and those who follow him, as it is for himself, or it's more for those. He clearly just was interested. He said the learning was for his own sake, but also for that of others. Just as he himself had been aided by the work of the church fathers who came before him, he was wanting to pass on and to help those who came after him. And the final, fourth component, alongside God-given gifts, God-given desires, the needs of the broader community, the fourth thing that comes together to make this, I think, a story of a sort of vision of a vocation is circumstances that enable the desires to be fulfilled, the gifts to be developed and put to use, and the fruits of all this to be handed on. Circumstances like an extraordinary collection of manuscripts in his monastery, a good enough system of education, a period of peace, supportive abbots. So one model of vocation, it seems to me, is when the greatest gifts and the deepest desires can come together so that a person fulfills their own nature while being able to serve, to give, to tend, to contribute to those around them. This is surely vocation is joy, a sense that a person is able to be who they were created to be by God, and from this gift of themselves which they have received, to give to others. We might say this is simultaneous self-fulfillment and self-donation. I don't know about you, but this is something I feel I sometimes see in certain people. Certainly, sometimes I see this in certain priests and ministers. Sometimes I see it occasionally in certain academics, in some teachers, in childminders, in car mechanics. I've seen it in some performers, in nurses, in midwives, all kinds of walks of life. And when you do, well, when I do think I've seen it, there's a kind of lift to the spirit, saying there's a person who's found their place in life, who's using their gifts, who's making a contribution. There's a kind of harmonious fit, and there's a sense of joy to see it, and one sense of joy to enact it. So my question is, can we generalize and say, this is the way that if you search hard enough, if you remain open enough, if you pray enough, this is the way your vocation can work out, that everyone's vocation is like this. That for each of us, there's some meeting of our desires, our gifts, the needs of the world that enables us to both fulfill ourselves and to give ourselves away, to give ourselves outward. That's a question. And before I try to answer the question, and I'm afraid my answer is no to that question. But I want to talk about my second figure from Christian history, Oscar Romero. So again, I'm sorry that you may be familiar, but just to briefly remind you of some of the outlines of Romero's life. He was born in 1917, so near the end of the First World War, in El Salvador, to a modest family. He began to train as a Catholic priest at the age of 13 or 14, and then he was sent to Rome and studied for 5 or 6 years. He began a doctorate, but was called back to work by his bishop, called back to his diocese in El Salvador. And he worked as a priest and then as a kind of diocesan bureaucrat until 1970, when he became an auxiliary bishop in San Salvador, in the capital. And then in 1977, he was appointed as the archbishop, so the top cleric in the country. Now, from what one can see, Romero was by nature quiet, introverted, shy, cautious, conservative with a small c, probably naturally so. If he wasn't a scholar like Bede, he was still someone, maybe he would have liked to have been a scholar. He was cut out for a placid, calm, focused life like Bede's, a life of quiet, committed pastoral work, and a life of keeping an institution functioning smoothly. This seemed to be what he was at ease with, without conflict. And yet, Oscar Romero has ended up becoming the patron saint of activists, of Catholic social justice organizations around the world. They'll all be converging in Rome, all the Caritas Internationalis, that they've all got Romero as their great symbol. They'll be converging for his canonization. This conservative, rather apolitical character has become the patron saint for social justice because he spoke out, he defied and challenged his government. He spoke out for the peasants, the campesinos, the poor people who were being tortured and killed and disappeared. In various ways, he broke the alignment between the church and the government. He refused to go to government sort of formal ritual ceremonies anymore, which was the traditional thing for the church to do until they began to investigate the murders. He used his homilies as a way to almost broadcast the news of who had been killed, what had happened, who had been tortured every week. He read letters in his homilies in quite a complex way for 3 years. He did what he could to defend and to speak for the people. And he did this in the face of death threats and of rebukes from Rome, from the nuncio from Rome. He was told at one point when he visited Rome that bishops shouldn't speak back when he tried to resist being told to get along with everyone and stop doing this. On the 23rd of March in 1980, he gave a homily in which, after having apparently discussed it with his legal team the day before, he commanded soldiers that there was a moral law which was higher than their orders, and they should disobey their orders and refuse to shoot their countrymen. And his most famous line on that day, "In the name of God then, in the name of this suffering people whose laments rise to heaven more tumultuously day by day, I ask you, I pray you, I order you in the name of God, halt the repression." And so that was the 23rd of March. On the 24th of March, which is his feast day, he was assassinated, shot down while saying Mass in an ordinary sort of way. So here in Archbishop Romero, we don't have a portrait of a life of a kind of peaceful harmony between the natural inclinations and gifts and the contributions to others. If Romero had a vocation in his final 3 years, it doesn't seem to have been a vocation to a life where interests and abilities all found integration, where fulfillment of himself and his gifts to others came together joyfully. He seemed, at least in part, yanked out of his ordinary way of being, frightened, troubled, struggling to find a new way, called to something which was not natural to him, and of course to something which led to premature death. So how should we think about these two models that I've somewhat arbitrarily put in front of you? Do we have to choose between them when we think about what vocation is? Between vocation as joy and vocation as interruption or disruption or even suffering and death? Or, to put it differently, between vocation as fulfillment and vocation as martyrdom? One view that some of you who are more radically inclined might take is that of these two, it's only in Romero that we have a template for a truly Christian vocation. Bede's life is all very nice, you might say, but what it offers us is a merely natural, human, secular almost vision of vocation, even though he was a monk. But it's a life in which a person develops and fulfills their particular gifts while finding an appropriate place in a community around them. And in Romero, we see a call out from this comfortable pattern, a call to follow the pattern very specifically of Christ, with the cross at its center. And you could, if you wanted to take this radical view, support this without too much difficulty by looking for examples of where there are callings in the Bible. Think of the figures who are called by God. Think of Moses and Abraham, all the way to the disciples and to Paul. They're called out of the familiar, beyond what seems fitted to their natural capacities. Moses is a stutterer, he's no leader. Abraham and his wife are much too old for all this stuff. What do fishermen know about being religious leaders? And at least in the New Testament, this is a call very often to follow Jesus on a path that leads to one's death. You know, and maybe to some degree, many of you would support this Romero is and Bede isn't Christian vocation line by looking at your own experience of vocation to ministry. My sense is that at least at some points in the Church of England, I'm not sure if it's shifting back again, but people often did something else. You start on one path in life and then you're called out of it into ministry on another. So there's a disruption, a change in pattern maybe in your experience. So there's a kind of temptation there, I think, to say Romero is more a template of Christian vocation than Bede. But I think there are some reasons to resist that. I really don't think we want to rule out the possibility that the person who lives a long life as a teacher or a palliative care nurse or a car mechanic cannot be, in doing so, responding to a call from God. And if we were to suppose that Christian vocation was always in the style of Romero and never in the style of Bede, that it's always disruptive or interruptive, always taking us away from what we're prepared for and what seems to fit with us, if we said that's a biblical fundamental criterion for vocation, we'd have to ask about where that would leave the process of discerning God's will in our lives. There'd be a worry, I think, that I could never have a sense of aligning myself with God's will, no hope to do it until something which went against the grain of things, something which demanded my death came along. It'd leave me either stuck, not knowing how to go about discerning God's will, I think, or it could very well lead down quite self-destructive paths, that only the thing that I don't enjoy, that I don't feel drawn toward, that I don't feel fit for, that's hardest and least pleasant for me, that must be what God wants. I think that would be a troublesome way to encourage people to discern their vocation. But the most fundamental reason that I think we can't say that only Romero is a true vocation and not someone on the model of Bede is trust in the doctrine of creation, and God is creator, the maker of all that is, the maker of each of us in our particularity. So I think we need to start with a fundamental affirmation of the goodness of who we are, and the way we think about lives, about the goodness of ourselves as gifts from God, the goodness of our gifts. So we need to think about vocation in a way that doesn't run roughshod over that. There's something wrong with supposing that God always works against what God has created, that he always has to work against the grain of our nature. So here I'm being a good Catholic and following Thomas Aquinas, who says that grace perfects and doesn't destroy nature, that we can't, that although Romero, the kind of vocation, that Romero is a clear model of Christian vocation for many, but we can't say it's always that kind of vocation that goes against and destroys us, even though that's a particularly moving model. So another option might be to say, well, there's no difference between them really, they come together. All vocations have some element of sacrifice and suffering to them. Even the teacher who loves their work has to do the marking. And the car mechanic has to put up with unpleasant customers and hot summers. Even priests who love their ministry have to put up with committee meetings and many harder things. So even if the one who is fulfilled by their vocation bears the cost cheerfully, it doesn't mean there is no cost and no suffering. And I'm sure that's true, but I'm a little hesitant to say that that means that all vocations are equally calls to the cross and calls to self-fulfillment, and there's no difference. We can come back to that in discussion, but I would rather, I think, let the two stories stand side by side to represent genuinely quite different paths that Christian vocation can take us on. I think that our starting point as we search for our vocation, or as we accompany others, supporting them in looking for their vocations, I think the default option has to be something closer to the Bede pattern. We may not all be as gifted or as focused as he was, but I think if we're searching for the direction that God is calling us, or if we're accompanying others in that search, we naturally look to the God-given gifts, to the deepest desires, to the situation we find ourselves in, to the community or communities in which we live. And in a prayerful kind of searching, we hope for these things to come together so that something of our gifts and desires meet the needs of our world. And when that happens, when we discern a calling of this sort, we can, in a sense, give back these gifts of God in giving them to others. And in doing that, we flourish. So I think that needs to be our kind of model one, you could say, of vocation. The joyful vocation, the joy of receiving gifts and of handing them on, the joy of doing that for which one was made. And I think that needs to be our starting point in thinking about vocation because of this fundamental trust in the goodness of God and God's gifts. But as I said before, I don't think we can turn that into a nice formula that says, with every person, if they're patient and they pray and they try and they're committed, such a vocation will emerge. For one thing, even apart from thinking about Romero, I think there is such a thing as a frustrated vocation. There are people who have a particular set of gifts and desires and a sense of a contribution they can make, which is nevertheless, through no fault of theirs, frustrated. And I'm not here thinking about the person who gets turned down from ordination because they're convinced they have a vocation, but everybody else can see that they don't. I suppose I'm thinking a little bit more of, say, if I give a couple of examples. One would be, say, a nun whom I know who was very athletic, very extroverted, very dynamic, and wanted to be a teacher. And she was a teacher, but at a certain point she had after effects of childhood polio and a crumbling spine that meant that she had to be mostly horizontal. So she had to cease being a teacher. So all this vibrancy and this natural giftedness, which was outflowing as a teacher, was thwarted. Now, as it turned out, she told me that when she had to spend all her time lying down, she was a lying duck for people to come and talk to, a sitting duck, but lying down, that people liked to come and tell her their spiritual worries, and a whole new life flourished for her as a kind of spiritual director, accompanier of people, and she continued to lead a very vibrant life. So we can say, okay, sometimes one vocation is frustrated and something else emerges in the ruins of it. But to tell you another story of someone I know, I have a friend who spent a long time wrestling with whether it was or wasn't her vocation to work in a homeless charity run by the Church of Scotland, particularly for alcoholics and drug addicts. And she had this vague sense that she had too much education for this. She was a little bit underemployed. She was just constantly, not progressing. But I realized over the years that what she was telling me was that even though these external signs suggested she should be doing something more impressive, this was her vocation. She felt she was in the right place. She was using what she had. It was meaningful. And then she had some bouts of chronic fatigue syndrome. And it went on long enough that she's had to give up her job prematurely. And there's a kind of suffering there from illness, but the suffering is not necessarily suffering of pain. It's suffering of the thwarting of, I think, what you could say is a genuine vocation. We can talk about that later as well, whether it's possible to be frustrated in your vocation. Where was I? But those are stories of sort of middle-class people on a professional track or semi-professional track who get frustrated. I think even more fundamentally, we have to say that poverty and destitution and instability can mean that many people have no chance to develop their gifts. There are vocations that should have been that never even begin to develop, where even thinking about what are God's gifts to me that can become my gifts to others never happens, where survival day by day, keeping on, early death, those are the marks of people's life rather than a flourishing vocation. So I think it's part of the tragic brokenness of our world, part of the evil that afflicts us, that we just can't say, yes, everyone can surely develop their God-given vocation. But then even when a vocation can be discerned and followed, sometimes the path of that vocation will turn out to be a path like that of Romero. So even though I don't think Romero kind of path should be our sole way of thinking, we have to remember that that is one shape that our vocation can take. Sometimes it does disrupt and disturb and call away from the natural development, the natural maturing, the fulfillment of potential. Sometimes grace and the movement of the Holy Spirit don't fulfill and perfect our natural gifts and talents and our natural dispositions, but drag us away from them. Sometimes they call us more or less directly to the cross, to suffering and even death. So I think in thinking about our own lives and those of others, we need to be open to this too as a possibility. That is not a kind of vocation that we can seek or plan for. But we do need to keep an eye on the possibility that this is a direction that God's voice might be calling us. It's also not a vocation we can rule out. It's a kind of delicate balance as I see it. We can't go hunting for a vocation which disrupts and unsettles and turns us on our head. We can't try to turn ourselves on our own heads, you could say. But we also can't forget to, or refuse to consider that this may be exactly where the Spirit is leading us. And maybe at a time like the one that we're now in, and the one that we're now moving towards, at a time of mass migration, growing social tensions, rising tide of lies in public life, a time of newly unleashed hatred and fear and bigotry, maybe somehow in this time a Romero style of calling will turn out to be the calling of many more of us and those we work with. So in the end, and I'm coming 10 minutes early to my end, so longer time for coffee, I think even though I've been talking about two models of vocation, however different the form it takes, there really is, of course, only one calling. It's Christ who calls all to follow him. And whether to be true in this following, we travel a path through our fullest flourishing or a path of suffering and sacrifice and loss, we know with the Apostle Paul that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, nor height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord.